Earlier this year, you probably noticed shortages of some items like paper products and household goods. If you tried to buy a laptop in the last couple months, chances are you had pretty slim pickings. Well, these are all the result of supply chain shortages brought about by the pandemic. Today, I want to re-examine the Toyota production system, a lean supply chain ethos brought about by Toyota and adopted now by many of the world's leading manufacturers. Specifically, I want to call in question the concept of keeping your inventory very limited. First, a little background on the Toyota production system. You probably know that Japan is an island that until very recently was relatively politically isolated. Its size and detachment meant that it had access to very few natural resources to begin with. Well, due to the destruction of World War II, Japan was further burdened by a lack of manufacturing capacity. Companies there had to be very scrappy with how they sourced components and materials such as steel. Toyota started producing cars in 1933. During the war, they had to reduce things to the bare minimum, so they simplified with things like only having one headlight, only putting brakes on the front axle, and using plywood for some body parts. In the 1950s, Eiji Toyota and Taiichi Ohno traveled to the US to visit Ford's River Rouge plant. The Japanese guests were impressed with the operation, but in resource-limited Japan, they knew that they would have trouble building something at that scale. They just couldn't have all their cash tied up in inventory. So instead, they developed the concept of manufacturing just in time. Instead of large batches, they would only manufacture small quantities of components at a time. Instead of running the assembly line at full speed and reworking defective units, any worker could pull a cord to stop the production line as soon as they encountered a problem. This not only reduced cost, but it also drastically increased quality. And when the oil crisis hit in the 1970s, this lean manufacturing system was able to scale to meet the very high demand for small, efficient vehicles. It's this same philosophy that enables them to be one of the highest volume automakers to this day. And this strategy has been adopted by leading firms such as Apple, Boeing, and Intel. Let's fast forward to the past few years. The US very rapidly imposed trade restrictions on a number of countries, but especially China. Many people think that the main goal of the tariffs is to bring manufacturing back to the US, and indeed that's how it's been sold to us. But if you start digging into it, in my opinion, I don't think that's really the case. Instead, it seems to be written with the goal of reducing economic dependence on China and reducing the flow of money between the two countries. And what seems to be happening so far is that companies are starting to diversify their supply chains. So instead of single sourcing from China, they're starting to put manufacturing locations in other countries as well. In my opinion, onshoring, actually bringing manufacturing jobs back to the US, would require more of a carrot and stick approach, but what we're seeing with the tariffs is just a stick. Now, diversifying supply chains is not something that happens overnight. In many industries, China had up to a 25 or 30-year head start, and it's not so easy to move your equipment, your training, your knowledge base, and invest in a new country overnight. I'm not saying that it's not worth it, I'm just saying that it's not exactly easy like flipping a switch. You may not be aware of this, but a lot of the machinery and expertise to develop modern products was developed in China. And it's not like China exactly wants to just let go of this on a whim. The upshot is, with the trade war ongoing for a few years now, some companies have had the chance to start diversifying to other countries. And a lot of this is actually driven by economics because the cost of labor is actually going up in China. So it's not just driven by the trade war, but I do think that the trade war definitely helped accelerate some of this movement. Let's talk about supply chain specialization. It's not like COVID is the first natural disaster to ever happen, and with any disaster you do have some degree of supply chain disruption. For example, Thailand produces about half of the hard drives for computers in the world, and when major flooding hit there in 2011, their supply chains were severely disrupted for months. This had ripple effects on the entire PC industry. We can identify many other areas of specialization. The area around Shenzhen, China, manufactures a large majority of the world's smartphones. There's just one company that manufactures all of the processors for these devices, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, and their operations are centered around 3 facilities in one country, Taiwan. And the refining of neodymium, a material that's used in everything from the magnets in headphones all the way up to electric vehicle batteries, well, that is almost entirely done in China. Centralizing a supply chain does have its benefits. For one, you can reduce shipping times and having things happen like customs delays. Just like you tend to find highly educated talent clustered in megacities, you also find manufacturing resources and know-how concentrated within specific regions. And when everything's so close together, you're more flexible in terms of your supply chain, so you can increase the rate of innovation. This all works fine unless there's some kind of natural disaster or unanticipated political event. COVID, the Thailand flooding, the Japanese tsunami, and many other natural disasters happened in the past and will certainly happen in the future. And rising political tensions certainly have certain companies reevaluating their risk assessments. I have no doubt that the largest firms are putting in massive efforts to diversify at this point, now that they've seen what can happen. Indeed, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company announced this year that it's planning to open a facility in Arizona. And Samsung has ceased manufacturing in China, and they've moved more production to Vietnam. Think about everything that goes into making a car. Now just think about the navigation system in that car. Do you really think that Ford and Toyota manufactured the screen or the semiconductors used inside that thing? Of course they don't. They buy them from somebody else. Modern products tend to be extremely complex, and there are very few companies that will own the entire means of production. Instead, they will outsource certain parts of the manufacturing process. This is a good thing because it tends to lead to more innovation across the board when you have individual companies specializing on certain areas. But it also means that many companies who are buying things only know their supply chain 1 or 2 levels deep. They know the people who they're buying them from directly, and maybe the suppliers that feed into that supplier. This can be inefficient. Everyone wants their share of the pie, driving up costs. Not knowing the physical locations of all your suppliers means you cannot make accurate risk calculations. Supply chain opacity can also introduce delays and quality issues that could be resolved with a more holistic look at the supply chain. Doing such a deep dive into your supply chain is not exactly an easy feat. Most companies are not exactly willing to reveal their suppliers unless there's something in it for them. Indeed, after the tsunami in 2011, one of the major Japanese semiconductor manufacturers had 100 of their employees go research all of the locations that fed into their manufacturing supply chain. It took them more than a year. But the pain, effort, and expense is probably worth it, especially for larger companies. Having deep awareness of your supply chain gives you a lot of leverage, as evidenced by Apple, which has a tight grip on its supply chain's quality and costs. I listened to a Harvard Business Review podcast discussing a ventilator manufacturer and how it had to rapidly increase their production capacity to meet the demands of the pandemic. Before COVID-19, it took them up to 2 years to produce units, from sourcing all the parts to the final delivery. But because of the pandemic, they were able to get their lead times down to about 12 weeks. Now, imagine what that would have been like if they didn't have a pandemic. If all the supply chains feeding into their supply chain were running on time, things could have worked a lot more smoothly and they could have had quicker delivery. It's not just a matter of pushing your suppliers either. You really have to question the way you do things and figure out if you can find a better way. Keep asking why. At the end of World War II, the US was the world's leader in steel production, and a lot of the manufacturing investments had been completely depreciated at that point. We really were at the top. Meanwhile, if you looked at a country like Germany or Japan, their resources had been almost completely destroyed, and they had to innovate from the bottom up and come up with really clever solutions. Well, they grew so rapidly that they stole a lot of the market share from the US steel companies, while the US largely remained complacent. There is an exception here, which is Nucor Corporation. They invested in this technology called mini mills, which were a lot cheaper than the traditional steelmaking equipment at the time. And now they are the largest steel producer in the US, and they claim to be one of the most profitable steel companies in the world. At this point, China and India have eclipsed everyone in terms of absolute steel production capacity. But I think the lesson here is very simple. If you stop innovating, somebody else is going to take the lead. We talked about diversification, transparency, and innovation, and in my opinion, these are all things that you should look at in your supply chain before defaulting to holding extra inventory. When you hold extra inventory, you decrease the rate of innovation and you increase the chance of a defect propagating across your product line. At the same time, my company ended up holding extra inventory at the end of last year because we were unsure of holiday demand and we ended up buying extra. Well, that extra inventory ended up saving us at the beginning of the pandemic because our means of production was backlogged during that time. But that's only a move you should make when you're working on innovation, transparency, and diversification. It's a tool you use to hold you over while you're implementing those new processes. You can also use inventory after you have a better understanding of your supply chain, but before you're able to diversify or innovate. Any supply chain is going to have some level of uncertainty in certain areas, and those are the ones you want to think about buffering. You just don't want to do it too much. In the end, I think the Toyota production system holds up if you stay true to its principles. Focus on innovation and continuous improvement. Only use inventory as a tool when you have to, and be cautious with it. So, those are my thoughts on the Toyota production system and supply chain innovation. I have more videos on this channel about supply chains, hardware products, and product management, so check those out if you're interested in learning more. With that said, I want to say thank you so much, and I hope you have a great day.